The morning sun rose over the square like a cruel overseer, burning away the mist that tried to hide what was coming. Dust clung to everything, the cracked boards of the platform, the sweat on men's necks, and the faint tremble in the air that smelled of tobacco and fear. Voices filled the space, sharp, careless, heavy with laughter that did not belong to mercy. Somewhere, a hammer struck iron, and a woman cried softly behind her hand. The sound vanished into the noise of the crowd. Among them stood a young woman, thin, barefoot, her wrists marked by rope. Her name was Clara. The name was small enough to hide behind. She whispered it under her breath, as if saying it might keep her from disappearing completely. Her eyes didn't lift to the people gathered before her. She didn't need to look to know what they saw. A body, a price, a number to be called out. Not a person, never a person. The auctioneer stood tall on the platform, his hat tilted back, his voice practiced like a hymn without soul. "Next up," he shouted, "strong field hand, good for housework too. Name's Clara, fine young thing, about 20 or so." He paused, waiting for someone to laugh, and they did. The laughter was low, cruel, as if it had been practiced too. Clara's fingers pressed against her belly without thought. It was instinct, the way a mother shields what she cannot protect. Her stomach barely showed, but she knew. She carried a secret, one she had never asked for, one that tied her to a man she'd prayed to forget. The crowd shifted. Boots scraped, coins clinked. A man in a long coat stepped forward, his voice thin and sharp. 10 cents, he called, with a smirk that said it was a joke. The auctioneer scoffed. 10 cents? She's worth more than that, surely. But no one else spoke. No one raised a hand. The laughter started again, meaner this time, as if the air itself enjoyed it. The auctioneer shrugged and slammed his palm on the post beside him. "Sold," he said flatly. 10 cents. The crowd chuckled, dispersing like vultures after the feast. The man who had spoken, Samuel Whitmore, didn't laugh. He stepped forward, paid the coins without looking at them. They fell into the auctioneer's hand with the dull sound of something unholy. Samuel wasn't young. His eyes had the tired calm of a man who'd watched too much of the world rot from the inside. He wore no smile, no cruelty, only silence. Clara didn't move until the rope at her wrist loosened. She waited for the shove, the slap, the command, but none came. Samuel simply nodded toward the wagon waiting by the road. "Come," he said. One word, quiet. The air shifted. Even that small kindness sounded strange, like a language she had forgotten. Clara hesitated before stepping off the platform, her legs unsteady. The ground felt foreign under her feet, as if it belonged to someone else, which of course it did. They walked through the edge of the crowd, past men who grinned and women who turned away. Someone whispered, 10 cents? He must be soft. Another voice followed, or maybe she's cursed. Clara didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road, on the line of dust that stretched toward the horizon. Each step away from the square felt like walking through invisible chains, lighter, yet still there. Samuel said nothing as they reached the wagon. He climbed onto the front seat, took the reins, and waited for her to climb into the back. For a moment she didn't move. The habit of fear was strong. It made her wait for permission she no longer needed, but couldn't stop asking for. Finally, she climbed in, sitting on the rough boards. Her hands folded in her lap, trembling slightly. The wagon creaked forward, wheels crunching over stones. Behind them, the town grew smaller, swallowed by the shimmer of heat and distance. The auction square faded into memory, but the echo of it stayed in her bones. The shouts, the laughter, the word sold cutting through her like a brand. The road ahead was quiet, broken only by the sound of the horses' hooves and the soft rattle of the wagon. Clara's eyes moved to the horizon, to the tall trees swaying in the wind, to a sky that looked too blue for such a cruel day. Her thoughts turned inward, drifting like shadows across her mind. She wondered what kind of man bought a woman for 10 cents. Was it pity? Was it cruelty dressed in gentleness? Or was it something she couldn't name? A plan she didn't yet see? The baby moved inside her then, a faint flutter. She pressed her palm against her belly again, her eyes filling with quiet tears. For a heartbeat, she imagined a life where that small motion meant something other than fear. Samuel glanced back once. Their eyes met, hers full of questions she couldn't speak. His, full of something unreadable. Not kindness exactly, but not indifference either, just something human. The wind carried the last sounds of the town away. The laughter, the hammer, the call of the auctioneer. All that was left was the road, stretching endlessly through fields of dry grass, and the faint sound of the wagon rolling toward a place called the Whitmore Plantation. Clara closed her eyes and whispered to herself, barely a breath. 10 cents. That's what I'm worth now. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. But somewhere deep beneath the fear, another voice, small, defiant, answered her back. Not forever. The wagon kept moving, creaking toward whatever waited beyond the trees. The sun dipped lower, spilling red across the sky, as if the world itself bled for what it had witnessed. The road stretched long and tired before them, bordered by tall pines that whispered secrets to the wind. The day had worn itself out. Shadows gathered in the corners of the fields, and the first stars began to blink awake, pale and uncertain. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, her hands clasped in her lap. The ropes that once bound her wrists now gone, but still remembered by her skin. Every sound, the groan of the wheels, the flap of a bird's wing, the sharp crack of Samuel's reins, made her tense. It was strange to move through open air and still feel trapped. They reached the plantation just as the last light faded. The Whitmore house rose from the dark like a memory, wide, tired, and lonely. White paint peeled from the columns. The porch sagged in the middle like it was bowing under old grief. There was no laughter, no voices, just the soft hum of the night and the steady breathing of the horses. Samuel stopped the wagon in front of the house. He climbed down, his boots crunching against gravel, and looked back at her. For a long moment he said nothing, only motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the side fields where a few cabins stood, their chimneys sending up thin threads of smoke. The familiar scent of ash and damp wood filled the air. "Go on," he said quietly, not unkindly. His voice was worn like his coat, rough around the edges but not sharp. Clara stepped down slowly. The earth beneath her feet felt cool and strange, as if it belonged to someone else, which it did. Every inch of ground here was owned, named, counted. A lantern flickered near the main door. A man about her age appeared, tall, serious, his clothes simple but clean. His name, she would later learn, was Henry. He looked at her, then at Samuel, a question flickering behind his calm expression. "Put her in the kitchen quarters," Samuel said. "She'll rest tonight." Henry nodded. He didn't look at her again as he turned toward the side path. Clara followed him, her eyes sweeping across the yard, the barns, the old oak trees, the faint glimmer of fireflies floating above the grass. The plantation was quiet, almost too quiet. They reached a small cabin near the back of the house. Henry opened the door, and the scent of smoke and bread drifted out. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of wood and herbs. 3 women turned to look at her, one old, one middle-aged, and one younger than Clara herself. Their faces held the kind of silence that comes from knowing too much. Henry spoke softly. "This is Clara. Master said she'll be staying here." The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and nodded once. Her eyes moved to Clara's face, reading every line like a story already written. "You can take the cot by the corner," she said, her voice rough but not unkind. "Ain't much, but it's clean." Clara murmured a thank you that came out more like a breath than a word. She walked to the corner, sat on the edge of the cot, and stared at the flicker of the fire in the small hearth. The younger woman leaned close and whispered, "Don't trust him too easy." "Kind eyes can turn mean quick," Clara didn't answer. She'd learned that silence could be safer than truth. From the window she could see the faint outline of the big house. One light burned in an upstairs window, a lonely glow that flickered against the dark. For reasons she didn't understand, it made her chest ache. Later, when the cabin had quieted and the other women had drifted into uneasy sleep, Clara lay awake listening to the night. Crickets sang like an old hymn. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. Her mind wandered to the child growing inside her. She traced her hand over her stomach, whispering to it in words too soft to reach the air. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I'll find a way to keep you safe." Outside, footsteps approached. They were slow, deliberate. The door creaked open slightly and Samuel's shadow filled the frame. He didn't step in, just stood there, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought food," he said quietly. "You didn't eat at the auction." Clara sat up, uncertain. He set the bundle near the door. Bread, a bit of meat, a small tin of water, and stepped back. "Thank you," she said, the words trembling on her tongue. He nodded once, then added, "You can rest here. No one will harm you under my roof." He turned to leave. Something in his tone was strange, not pity, not authority, but a kind of weary promise. Still, Clara had heard promises before. They often turned to ashes. When he was gone, she stared at the food for a long while before touching it. The bread was rough and stale, but it tasted like life. The night deepened. Rain began to fall softly against the roof. Clara sat by the small window, watching the droplets trace slow lines down the glass. She thought of the auction, the jeers, the words sold, the sound of coins. 10 cents, the price of a soul, yet here she was, still breathing, still holding on to a fragment of hope she didn't dare name. Her thoughts turned to Samuel Whitmore. His face had been unreadable, his eyes too still. She couldn't decide if that silence meant kindness or something else entirely. Maybe he pitied her. Maybe he needed her for something she didn't yet understand. In the distance, thunder rolled, low and restless. The other women stirred in their sleep. One whispered a prayer under her breath. Clara did too, though she didn't know if anyone was listening. When the storm passed, the world smelled clean again. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the rain lull her towards sleep. For the first time in months, she wasn't standing in chains, wasn't waiting for the next command, but freedom, she knew, was not just the absence of chains. It was something deeper, something she wasn't sure she would ever find here. As sleep took her, a single thought lingered, that maybe kindness could be as dangerous as cruelty. If she started to believe in it, the candle burned low. The wind sighed through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the scent of pine and old sorrow. And somewhere in the dark house beyond, Samuel sat alone by his fire, staring into the flames as if searching for something he'd long ago lost. Morning came quietly, as if the sky itself feared to wake the world. A mist hung over the fields, thin and silver like ghosts rising from the earth. Clara stood by the small window of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee, her eyes tracing the outline of the Whitmore house through the fog. It had been 3 weeks since the auction. The days bled together, rising before the sun, hauling water, scrubbing floors, mending what needed mending. The routine wrapped around her like an invisible cage. Yet inside that rhythm, something strange was beginning to stir. Samuel Whitmore was not like other masters she had known. He spoke little, shouted even less. His rules were clear, his punishments almost unheard of. Still, the silence he carried was heavier than any whip. It filled the air around him like a ghost he couldn't shake. At night, when the chores were done, Clara would sit by the hearth, staring into the fire while the other women whispered stories or sang low songs to chase away the dark. Sometimes she caught herself wondering what Samuel thought of when he sat alone in that large, empty house. That morning, as she scrubbed the wooden steps of the porch, the door behind her creaked open. She froze, heart quickening. "You've missed a spot." His voice was even, not unkind. Clara turned her head slightly, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir." Samuel stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't dressed like most planters. No fine coat, no polished boots. Just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up, a streak of dust across his arm. He crouched down, his shadow falling across her hands. "Clara," he said almost gently. "You don't have to call me sir. Samuel will do." Her hands paused. The water rippled in the bucket. She didn't answer. The habit of deference was too deeply carved into her bones. He watched her for a long moment before standing again. "When you're done, go to the barn. Henry needs help sorting the feed." "Yes, Samuel," she said, barely more than a whisper. He nodded once, then walked off toward the fields. Clara exhaled slowly, unsure whether to fear him more or less now. That night, the nightmares came again. She dreamed of the old plantation, the sound of boots in the hall, the smell of smoke and whiskey, the creak of the door that never stayed closed. In her dream, the voice was always the same, soft, cruel, whispering her name like a curse. She woke with a cry caught in her throat, her breath shallow, her hands clutching the thin blanket. The fire had gone out. Only the pale light of the moon came through the window. From outside came a sound, footsteps hesitant but near. The door opened slightly, and the warm glow of a lantern spilled across the floor. Samuel stood there, face half in shadow. "I heard you," he said quietly. "You were crying." Clara wiped her face quickly, shaking her head. "Just a bad dream, that's all." He stepped closer, setting the lantern on the small table. The flame flickered, painting the room in gold and amber. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. "No one will touch you again." Her eyes lifted then, meeting his for the first time since the auction. There was something in his expression, not pity, but understanding. As if he'd seen something in his life that broke him too. "How do you know what I'm afraid of?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, the weight of the question pressing between them. "Because fear looks the same on everyone," he said at last. Silence filled the space between them, not cold, not cruel. Just quiet, human. He turned to go, but before he reached the door, she spoke again. Her voice trembled. "You shouldn't have bought me." He stopped, his hand on the latch. "Maybe not," he said, "but I couldn't leave you there." He left then, closing the door softly behind him. Clara sat for a long time, staring at the dying lantern flame. She didn't understand him, and that frightened her more than any whip ever could. Kindness was a dangerous thing. It made you hope. The next day she worked in the barn beside Henry. The air was thick with the smell of hay and dust. Light filtered through the slats in pale, golden lines. Henry broke the silence. "He's different, you know." "Master Whitmore?" Clara didn't look up. "Different how?" "He used to have a wife," Henry said, tying a sack of feed. "Died some years back. After that, he changed. Doesn't much care for company. Folks around here say he ain't right in the head. Too soft on the hands he owns." "Soft?" Clara said, her voice bitter without meaning to be. "Ain't no such thing as a soft master." Henry gave a half smile. "Maybe not, but he ain't cruel either. That's worth something." That night, Clara sat outside the cabin, watching the sky turn violet and then black. Fireflies drifted through the air like tiny candles. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe without counting the cost. Inside her, the baby stirred. She laid her hand over her belly, feeling the faint flutter, and whispered to it, "You'll never know what I knew. You'll never hear chains." Behind her, the big house stood quiet. A single light burned in the upstairs window again, the same one every night. She wondered if Samuel couldn't sleep either. Maybe the past haunted him too. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, in the hush between the chirping of crickets, she almost believed that redemption might be possible. Not for the world, but for two broken souls trying to survive inside it. The wind rose, carrying the scent of the fields and the promise of rain. Clara whispered one last thought into the night, not to anyone in particular, maybe to God, maybe to herself. Let tomorrow be gentler than today. The lantern in the big house flickered once, then went dark. The sky broke open before dawn. Rain came down in silver sheets, turning the dirt road into rivers of mud. Inside the small cabin, the fire burned low, its light trembling against the walls like a candle inside a storm. Clara sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around her swollen belly. The months had passed quietly, each day marked by the rhythm of work, by whispers and small mercies. The others had grown used to her silence. They spoke of her softly, as if she were both a secret and a warning. A woman carrying a child that wasn't hers to claim, living on borrowed peace in a world that owned her name. Clara's body had changed. Her steps were slower, her breath shorter. Sometimes she caught Samuel watching from a distance, not with pity, but with something heavier, something that looked almost like guilt. He never spoke of it, and neither did she. Between them, silence had become its own language. As the storm rumbled outside, Clara felt the first pain twist deep inside her. It was sharp, sudden, a knife made of muscle and memory. She gripped the edge of the chair, gasping softly. The old woman, Ruth, looked up from her sewing. "Child?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with knowing. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Ruth set her sewing aside and rose, her hands steady, her face calm. "It's time then," she said. "Ain't no turning back now." The other women moved quickly, quiet but sure. They stoked the fire, boiled water, tore strips of cloth. Outside, thunder cracked like the world was splitting in two. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythm of pain and breath. The air in the cabin was thick with sweat and rain and fear. Clara bit her lip until she tasted blood, but she didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that pain didn't listen to screaming. Between the contractions, she drifted in and out of dreams. Flashes of faces she wanted to forget. Hands that took and took. A voice that whispered her name in the dark. But through it all, one thought kept her anchored. This child will not belong to them. When the next wave hit, she grabbed Ruth's arm, her voice breaking. "Please, not yet. Not here." Ruth pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "Hush now," she said. "You bring that baby into this world. Don't let it break you." Outside, a lantern moved through the rain. The door burst open, wind sweeping through. Samuel stood in the doorway, drenched, his face pale under the flicker of firelight. Ruth glared at him. "Ain't no place for you here, master," she said, but he didn't move. "I heard her cry out," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't stay away." Clara could barely see him through the haze of pain. She only heard his voice, steady, grounding, the one sound in the storm that didn't frighten her. Another contraction came, harder than the last. She screamed then, not from fear but from life fighting its way through her. Ruth called for towels, for water. The women moved in rhythm, hands sure and hearts steady, and then suddenly, silence. A thin cry split the air, sharp and perfect. The kind of sound that cuts through centuries of suffering and still finds a way to mean hope. Ruth lifted the small, trembling child and wrapped him in cloth. "It's a boy," she said softly. "A fine boy." Clara reached out with shaking hands. When Ruth placed the baby in her arms, the world seemed to stop. His skin was pale, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling against her chest. His cries softened into a whimper and then quieted altogether as she rocked him. She stared at him, not with joy, not yet. With disbelief, with awe, with something too sacred to name. Samuel stood a few steps away, the rainwater dripping from his hair onto the wooden floor. He looked at the child as if seeing all the sins of the world gathered into one small, innocent face. Ruth broke the silence. "He'll need a name," she said. Clara didn't answer. She could barely breathe. Samuel took a slow step forward. His voice was rough, uncertain. "Hope," he said quietly. "Name him Hope." The word hung in the air, fragile as glass. Clara looked up at him, her eyes red, her voice hoarse. "Hope," she repeated, tasting it like something she wasn't sure she deserved. Ruth smiled faintly. "Then Hope he'll be." The storm outside began to ease. Rain softened to drizzle, thunder rolling farther away until it was only an echo. Clara leaned back against the wall, her baby pressed to her chest. The firelight danced across her face, exhaustion, relief, and something close to peace. Samuel turned toward the door, but before he left, he spoke softly. "You both rest now. I'll see to it no one disturbs you." Clara wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. He lingered for a moment longer, then stepped out into the rain. Through the window she saw him pause in the yard, his head bowed, his shoulders heavy. For the first time she saw the weight he carried, not just of ownership, but of conscience. She looked down at the child again. His breathing was steady, his tiny face calm. In that moment, for the first time since she could remember, Clara felt something bloom inside her. Fragile, trembling, Alive. Not joy. Not yet, but hope, just as he had named him. She whispered to the sleeping child, "You were born in a storm, little one. Maybe that's why you'll survive the world." The fire crackled softly, rain tapping against the roof like a lullaby. Outside, the first light of morning began to break through the clouds, painting the horizon in pale gold, and for one brief moment, the plantation was quiet. No chains, no shouting, only the soft sound of a mother's breath and a baby's heartbeat. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered. The fields glistened beneath a soft light, every leaf jeweled with rain. Inside the cabin, Clara sat by the fire with her son in her arms. Little Hope slept soundly, his tiny breath steady against her heart. The world outside still felt cruel, but for now, inside this small corner of it, there was peace. Days became weeks, and the rhythm of life began again. Clara rose with the dawn, tended to her chores and cared for her baby between the moments of labor and rest. The other women helped when they could. Ruth with her rough hands and steady wisdom, young Mary with her laughter that tried to fill the silence. But everything had changed. Not just for Clara, but for Samuel too. The man who had once moved through his land with quiet detachment now walked differently. Slower, heavier, as if weighed down by something unseen. He spent more time in the fields than in his grand house. He no longer joined the neighboring planters for their meetings, nor did he boast of his harvest or his property like they did. One afternoon, Henry found him sitting beneath the old oak, the one that shaded the edge of the cotton rows. He was staring at the horizon, his hands resting on his knees, his face drawn and tired. "Everything all right, master?" Henry asked cautiously. Samuel didn't look up. "Do you ever think," he said slowly, "about what happens when a man realizes he's been wrong his whole life?" Henry frowned. "Can't say I've had the freedom to think on that, sir." Samuel gave a faint smile, the kind that carried no joy. "No, I suppose not." He stood, brushing the dust from his hands. "Get the men ready for tomorrow. We'll stop the picking early. They've done enough for the week." Henry blinked, surprised. "Sir?" "Enough," Samuel repeated firmly. Word spread quietly among the slaves. The master was changing. Some whispered that guilt had softened him. Others warned it was a trick, a test. But Clara, watching from the edge of her small world, saw something deeper. It wasn't guilt alone. It was awakening. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Samuel came to the cabin. Hope was asleep, and Clara was mending a torn sleeve by the firelight. She rose quickly when he entered. "You don't have to stand," he said gently. She hesitated, unsure what to do with her hands. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "No, quite the opposite." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn book. "Do you know what this is?" Clara shook her head. "It's a reader," he said, "for learning letters and words." Her eyes flickered with confusion, then disbelief. "You mean—" "For reading." "Yes," he said simply. "If you'd like, I can teach you." Clara stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "You'd risk that?" "It's against the law." He nodded. "I know. Why?" She whispered. Samuel's eyes softened. "Because ignorance is the cruelest chain I've ever seen, and because you deserve to know more than the world has told you." The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Clara's gaze dropped to the book. Its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. It looked like something fragile, forbidden, holy. That night she took her first lesson. They sat by the faint glow of the lantern, Hope sleeping beside her. Samuel drew letters in the dust on the floor. A, B, C, his voice low and patient. Clara traced them with her finger, whispering each sound like a prayer. When she stumbled, he smiled faintly. "It takes time," he said. She met his eyes. "Time's the only thing I've never owned." He looked away then, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. Days passed, and the lessons continued in secret. Each letter became a small rebellion, each word a step toward something greater. Clara's fear began to give way to curiosity. She found joy in the smallest victories, the way her tongue shaped a new word, the way Hope cooed when she whispered the alphabet softly to him. but not everyone on the plantation approved. One afternoon, as Samuel crossed the yard, two of the older men who worked the fields paused their talk and watched him pass. Their faces were wary. Word had begun to travel beyond the fences that Master Whitmore was losing his mind, teaching a slave to read, giving extra rest to his hands, refusing to sell. That night a letter arrived from a neighbor, written in fine cursive and heavy ink. Samuel, it read, "Your ways bring shame on decent men. You're soft, and softness invites trouble. You forget your place among us. Be careful. A man who forgets where he stands soon finds no ground at all." He folded the letter and tossed it into the fire without a word. The flames consumed it quickly, turning the ink to smoke. Later that night, he walked to the cabin again. Through the small window, he saw Clara reading slowly from the book, her lips moving as she whispered the words, her child asleep beside her. He didn't knock. He simply watched for a moment, the faintest trace of a smile on his face. A smile touched by both pride and sorrow. When he turned back toward the house, the stars above seemed closer than they had in years. The next morning, Clara found a small wooden box on her doorstep. Inside was a piece of paper, carefully folded, with her name written at the top, in her own handwriting. Her hands trembled as she read the single sentence beneath it. "You are free to dream." She pressed the note to her heart, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. In the distance, the sun rose golden over the fields. For the first time in her life, Clara felt something she couldn't name, not freedom. Not yet, but the first breath of it. Inside the big house, Samuel sat alone at his desk, his hands folded. His face turned toward the light. The world outside was changing, slowly, painfully. And so was he. It began with whispers. At first they came from the edge of the fields, from mouths too afraid to speak loud but too angry to stay silent. Then from porches, from meeting houses, from across the miles of farmland where men gathered to drink, to judge, and to plan. They said Samuel Whitmore had lost his mind, that he'd been touched and turned against his own kind, that he was teaching a slave woman to read, letting her rest, letting her child live under his roof as if it were his own blood. They called him a sympathizer, a danger, a traitor. And in the South of that time, a man didn't need to commit a crime to deserve punishment. He only needed to act human. Clara didn't know all of this at first. She only felt the shift in the air, the silence that stretched too long, the stares that followed when she went to fetch water. The other women grew quiet around her. Ruth wouldn't meet her eyes. One evening, as the last light of day sank behind the trees, Henry came to her cabin. His voice was low, his eyes restless. "You and the master best be careful," he said. Clara paused in her stitching. "Careful?" He nodded. "Some men rode by today. Didn't stop, just looked. You know the kind of looking I mean." She did. "The kind that stripped you without touching, the kind that promised pain." Henry swallowed hard. "They say there's talk of teaching the master a lesson, that he's making the rest look weak, that a man can't go changing the way things been without paying for it." Clara's hands trembled slightly. "And hope?" she asked. Henry's voice softened. "You keep that baby close. Don't let nobody take him from you." That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, rocking Hope in her arms, staring into the flames until the shapes blurred into memories of chains, of markets, of laughter that cut like knives. She thought of Samuel, of the book, of the letters she'd learned to trace. Words that had once meant nothing now filled her head like a hymn: freedom, mercy, love. The door creaked open. Samuel stood there, his face pale in the firelight. "I heard you were frightened," he said. Clara turned to him, her voice brittle. "You should be too." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I've had threats before. This ain't the same," she said. "You're changing things they were born to believe. Men don't forgive that." He took a breath, then knelt down beside her. Hope stirred in her arms but didn't wake. "If I run," he said softly, "what happens to all of you left behind? I can't just leave this land, or the people on it, in their hands." Her eyes glistened. "Then they'll burn it all down. You know they will." Samuel looked into the fire, his expression distant. Maybe they'll burn the field. Maybe they'll burn me. But if even one of you walks free before that happens, then maybe it's worth it. Clara shook her head. You think too much like a savior, she whispered. But saviors die. He looked at her then. Really looked. There was no answer in his eyes, only quiet acceptance. Outside, the wind shifted. The air smelled of smoke. The next morning they saw it. A section of the north field, blackened, the soil still smoking. Someone had poured oil over the cotton and set it aflame during the night. Samuel stood at the edge of the ruin, the ash coating his boots. Henry stood beside him, silent. Any idea who? Samuel asked. Henry hesitated. No names. But I heard a voice say, next time it won't be the fields. Samuel nodded slowly. Tell the others to stay close tonight. No one goes alone. He returned to the house, his face blank, his hands shaking only when he thought no one could see. That night the sound of horses came again, faint but deliberate. The dogs barked, the chickens scattered. Clara held hope tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the window she saw lanterns flickering in the distance, like fireflies moving closer. Samuel burst through the door moments later, his voice low but urgent. Gather what you can, he said. We may have to leave for a few days. Leave? Clara repeated. Where? There's a friend upriver, he said. Safe ground. He owes me a debt. She hesitated. And the others? His jaw tightened. They'll follow when it's time. Right now, I just need to get you and the boy out of sight. Clara wanted to argue, but when she saw his eyes, the same fear she carried, she nodded. They moved quickly, silent as ghosts. Ruth pressed a small bundle of bread into Clara's hands. Go, girl, she whispered. Don't look back. By midnight they were deep in the woods, the path lit only by Samuel's lantern. Crickets sang, the night thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Hope whimpered once, then fell quiet again. When they reached the river, Samuel stopped. The moonlight broke across the water in pale ribbons. He turned to Clara. We'll cross here. The current's weak tonight. She looked at the dark water, then at him. You sure we'll be safe? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the child in her arms. Then at her, this woman who'd once been bought for 10 cents and had somehow come to mean far more than any man's measure of worth. I'll keep my word, he said quietly. As long as I'm breathing, you'll be safe. The sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance. They both turned, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Go, Samuel whispered. Now. Clara stepped into the water, clutching hope to her chest. The cold bit through her dress, but she didn't stop. Behind her, Samuel followed, lantern dimmed, pistol drawn. The night swallowed them whole. Morning came slow after that night by the river. The world seemed heavy, as if even the sky had tired of carrying the weight of human cruelty. They'd found shelter in an old barn just beyond the edge of the Whitmore land, a place abandoned by time, where ivy crept through broken boards and dust hung like fog. Clara lay against the straw, hope pressed to her chest. He slept peacefully, unaware of the world's hunger. Samuel sat a few paces away, his back against a wooden beam, a pistol resting on his knee. Neither spoke. When the sun rose, he stood and looked toward the distant fields. Smoke still curled from the burned patch of land. The smell of it, bitter, familiar, clung to the air. They won't stop, he said quietly. Clara looked up. Then we keep moving, he shook his head. Not yet. If we disappear now, they'll burn everything and everyone we left behind. I need to go back, make them think you're still here. Her breath caught. No, if you go back, they'll kill you. Maybe, he said softly. But if I don't, they'll kill more than me. He turned to her then, his voice steady. You'll stay here till sundown. Henry knows where to find you if I don't return. She wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but the words fell heavy in her throat. Instead, she only whispered, Please come back. He managed a faint smile, the kind a man wears when he knows he might not keep his promise. By noon, he was gone. Clara watched him disappear down the narrow path, his figure swallowed by trees and fog. Then she was alone with her child and her fear. Hours passed. The sun crept west. Each sound, each creak, each whisper of wind made her heart jump. When Henry finally arrived, she nearly cried with relief. But something in his eyes stopped her. He wouldn't meet her gaze. "Where's the master?" she asked. Henry shifted on his feet. "He ain't back yet." "Then why are you here?" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "We need to move you now. They're coming this way." Clara froze. "Who?" He glanced toward the trees. "The riders. The ones from town. Said they know where you've been hiding." Clara stood quickly, clutching hope. "You told them," she whispered. Henry's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence was enough. "Why?" she said, her voice breaking. His shoulders sagged under the weight of shame. "They said they'd burn my wife's quarters if I didn't talk. Said they'd hang my boy. I didn't have no choice, Clara. I'm sorry." She shook her head slowly. "There's always a choice. You just didn't make the right one." He took a step forward, desperate. "Please, just..." But it was too late. The sound of horses broke through the air. Fast, hard, closing in. Clara turned and ran. She sprinted through the brush, hope crying in her arms, branches clawing at her dress. Behind her came the shouts, men's voices angry, eager. "There, get her." She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept running. Her breath tore through her throat. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic. The forest opened into a clearing, too wide, too bright. Before she could turn, a man on horseback cut across her path. "Stop right there, girl." She froze, clutching hope to her chest. The man dismounted slowly, a rope swinging from his saddle. "Gotcha now," he said, grinning. "Ain't no running this time." Two more riders emerged from the trees, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. One grabbed her arm, wrenching her backward. Hope screamed. "Please," she gasped. "Please, he's just a baby. Don't matter whose baby it is." One spat. "Ain't yours to keep." They dragged her back toward the road, her feet scraping the dirt. When they reached the wagon, a man with gray hair and a scar across his cheek climbed down. He looked at her, then at the child, and smirked. "Well, ain't this something?" he said. "The Whitmore girl and her little half-breed brat." He reached into his coat and pulled out a few coins, 10 cents, glinting dull in the sunlight. "Funny thing," he said, flipping one in his hand. "Same price she was bought for." He turned to his men. "Take her back to the market. Let's see if she's still worth what she was." Clara's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, clutching hope desperately. But the men tore him from her arms. His cry pierced the air, sharp as broken glass. "Don't!" she screamed. "He's all I have." One of the men shoved her forward, his voice cold. "You ain't got nothing no more." By the time the wagon began to roll, Clara's voice was gone. Her tears mixed with dust, her hands bound tight behind her back. Hope cried until he couldn't anymore. Miles away, Samuel returned to find the barn empty, the straw scattered, the footprints fresh in the mud. "Henry?" he called. The man emerged from the trees, his head lowered, his voice trembling. "They took her, sir. I couldn't stop 'em." Samuel stared at him, a silence so deep it made the air tremble. Then, without a word, he mounted his horse and rode. He didn't stop for food or water. He followed the wagon tracks through the fields, through the back roads, until the shouts of the auction rose like ghosts from the past. The same auction yard where he'd first seen her, where a woman trembling with shame had been sold for 10 cents. And now, she stood there again, chained, holding her child. The crowd gathered, laughing, spitting, bidding. Samuel watched from the edge, his face hidden beneath a hood. Every muscle in his body screamed to act, but he knew one wrong move could end it all. When the auctioneer called her name, Samuel raised his hand. $10, he said, his voice calm, steady, unrecognizable. The crowd murmured. The auctioneer smirked. $10 for the master's runaway slave. Well, ain't that generous? 15, another man called. 20, Samuel said. The bids rose, the air thick with cruelty and greed. Finally, silence. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, slamming his hand down. To the gentleman in the coat. Clara didn't look up. Not until he stepped forward, pulled back his hood, and whispered her name. Her breath caught in her throat. He pressed the money into the auctioneer's hand and turned to her. You're coming home, he said softly. and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe it. But the word home no longer meant the plantation. It meant escape. It meant freedom. The crowd began to disperse, unaware of the storm about to follow. Samuel took her hand. "We leave tonight," he whispered. The road beyond the auction yard was silent. Samuel led Clara and Hope through the narrow back alleys, their steps muffled against the dirt. He moved like a man who'd done this before, eyes scanning every shadow, hand steady on the pistol at his hip. Clara followed close behind, clutching the baby to her chest, her breath ragged from exhaustion and fear. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain and horses. Behind them, the town's laughter still lingered, cruel, careless, alive. No one had recognized Samuel fully in the dim light, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They reached the edge of town just before midnight. Samuel stopped and looked back once, the auction platform still visible in the distance, lit by a single lantern. It looked small now, insignificant. But to Clara it was still the place that had stolen everything from her twice. "Keep close," Samuel said softly. "We head north till the river bends. There's a trail, the start of the railroad." She nodded, saying nothing. Her arms ached from holding Hope, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. The trees swallowed them as they entered the woods. Branches brushed against their shoulders, and the ground beneath them turned soft and uneven. Fireflies blinked between the shadows, little bursts of light that came and went like breaths. After a long silence, Clara spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did you come for me?" Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the path. "Because I couldn't live knowing I'd let them break you." She shook her head. "They already did." He stopped then, turning toward her. "No," he said quietly. "You're still standing. That means they failed." For a moment, their eyes met. Two souls bruised by the same cruel world, both searching for something beyond survival. Then the baby stirred, breaking the spell. They kept moving. Hours passed. The forest thinned, opening into marshland. The air grew heavy, filled with the hum of insects and the scent of wet earth. Somewhere ahead, the river whispered, low, constant, promising a way forward. Clara stumbled once, catching herself on a tree. Her legs trembled. "I can't," she murmured. "Not anymore." Samuel turned back quickly. "Just a little farther." She clutched Hope tighter. "If they catch us, they won't," he said firmly. "Not tonight." But even as he spoke, he could feel it, the fear pressing in from every direction, the sense that the night was listening. They reached the river at last. It shimmered faintly under the moonlight, slow but deep. Samuel waded in first, the cold biting through his boots. He held out his hand. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward. The water rose to her knees, then her waist. She lifted Hope higher, whispering softly to him to stay still, to stay quiet. The crossing felt endless, the current tugging at her dress, the darkness blurring the world around them. But when they reached the far bank, she fell to her knees, gasping. Samuel crouched beside her, helping her up. "We're close," he said. "There's a cabin a mile ahead. They'll take us in." Clara looked up, eyes wide. "Who?" "Friends," he said. "People who believe like I do. The railroad runs through them. Safe houses all the way north." She had heard the stories whispered among the slaves, of angels who guided runaways under the cover of night, of stars that pointed toward freedom. She had never dared to believe them. They walked again, slower now. The forest around them began to change, less tangled, more open. The air carried a faint smell of smoke, not of destruction, but of warmth. Then she saw it, a small cabin tucked into the trees, its windows dark, but a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Samuel knocked 3 times, slow, then fast, then slow again. The door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. An older woman with sharp eyes and a quiet strength. "You took your time," she whispered. "Roads were watched," Samuel said. Her gaze shifted to Clara, then to the child. "You're safe here. Come inside." The cabin was warm, lit by a small fire and smelling faintly of bread and soap. Clara sank into a chair near the hearth, too tired to speak. The woman, her name was Abigail, brought water and clean cloth for the baby. Samuel stood by the window watching the dark. His hands trembled slightly, but his face was unreadable. After a while, Abigail spoke quietly. "They'll be looking for you by dawn. You can rest here till tomorrow night, then head for the next station. There's a wagon headed north, to Pennsylvania." Clara looked up, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "Freeland?" Abigail nodded. "Freeland, if you can get there." Clara turned toward Samuel, her lips trembling. "You'll come with us?" He hesitated. "I can't," he said finally, her breath caught. "You can't. They'll trace it back to me. If I go, everyone here pays for it. The only way this works is if they believe I'm still there, still playing their game." She shook her head, tears rising. "After everything," he stepped closer, his voice soft. "You don't need me to be free, Clara. You just need to keep walking." She wanted to speak, but her throat closed around the words. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, a touch so light it felt like memory more than skin. "When you cross that border," he said, "don't look back. Promise me." She nodded, her tears falling silently. Outside, dawn began to bleed through the trees, pale gold light touching the edge of the sky. Samuel turned toward the door. "They'll be coming soon. I'll lead them the wrong way." Clara stood, hope sleeping against her shoulder. "And if you don't come back?" He smiled faintly, sad, certain. "Then remember me as a man who finally did one thing right." He stepped into the morning, the light swallowing his figure as the forest closed behind him. Clara stood by the window, holding her child, watching until the last trace of him was gone. Then she whispered to the sleeping baby, her voice trembling but sure, "He gave us a road, my love. Now we walk it." The journey north began before sunrise. Abigail's wagon creaked under the weight of silence. No conversation, no laughter, only the slow rhythm of hooves and breath. The forest seemed endless, the road stretching like a thread through the unknown. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, hope nestled against her chest, wrapped in a worn quilt. Every jolt of the wheels made him stir, but he didn't cry. It was as if the child already knew that silence meant safety. She watched the trees pass, ancient oaks, whispering pines, the occasional open field glistening with dew. The air smelled of earth and freedom, yet every sound behind them still felt like danger. Abigail sat up front, reins in her hands, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You rest when we reach the safe house," she said quietly. "Ain't far now. Maybe another day." Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Abigail replied. "Thank the Lord and the good folk who built this road out of mercy." Clara looked down at her child. "And thank the man who sent us here." Abigail didn't answer, but the faintest shadow crossed her face, a mixture of understanding and sorrow. They rode through the day, stopping only when the sun reached its highest point. Clara stepped down from the wagon to stretch her legs, her bare feet pressing into the cool grass. Hope slept soundly, his tiny hand clutching a fold of her dress. She closed her eyes and listened to the rustle of the wind, the soft creak of the trees. For the first time she felt the world moving without chains. That night, they stopped near a creek. Abigail built a small fire, its light flickering against the darkening sky. The stars came out one by one, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting for them. Clara sat beside the fire, her son asleep in her lap. Abigail handed her a piece of bread and said, "You're almost there, child. Tomorrow night you'll reach the border." "The border?" Clara asked softly. Abigail nodded. "Once you cross the river, you'll be in free land, Pennsylvania. You'll have to take new names, start anew. There's a family waiting to take you in." Clara traced her fingers along the baby's curls. "New names," she whispered. "Feels strange to think I could be someone else." Abigail looked into the flames. "You already are. You ain't the woman they bought no more." Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes were wet. "And him?" she asked, glancing down at Hope. "What will he be?" Abigail's gaze softened. "He'll be what his mama teaches him. And from what I see, that's a mighty good start." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the night deepened. But when sleep finally came, Clara dreamed of Samuel. She saw him standing in the field, his coat torn, his hands stained with ash, looking toward the north, toward her. His lips moved, but no sound came. Only the wind carried his voice. "Keep walking." When dawn came, they were on the road again. The air was colder, sharper, the kind that wakes the bones and clears the mind. By evening, they reached the final stop, a small farmhouse hidden by tall grass. A man and woman waited outside, their faces kind but cautious. They led Clara and Hope inside, offered food, clean clothes, and warmth. After the meal, the man unrolled a map on the table. "The river's 1/2 mile east," he said. "Once you cross, you'll be free." Clara stared at the map, her heart pounding. The word free still felt unreal, like a story whispered in the dark. Abigail placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is where I leave you." Clara turned quickly. "You're not coming." Abigail smiled gently. "My road's back that way. Yours is forward. Don't you worry. You'll have help waiting on the other side." Clara rose to her feet, clutching Hope close. "I'll never forget you." Abigail nodded. "You don't have to, just live. That'll be thanks enough." The old woman's figure faded into the night as Clara began the last walk of her journey. The moon hung high, lighting the river ahead. Wide, silver, alive. The sound of the water filled the night, rushing eternal. Clara stepped to the edge and stared across. "This is it," she whispered. She lifted Hope into her arms, holding him tight. "We're almost free, my love." The water was cold, but she didn't stop. Each step was harder than the last, the current pulling at her skirt, her breath coming fast. But she kept her eyes forward. When she reached the far bank, she fell to her knees, gasping. Hope stirred, then opened his eyes, wide, clear, full of life. Clara pressed her lips to his forehead. "You're free," she whispered. "You'll never know the sound of chains." A rustle came from behind, footsteps. Clara spun, heart racing, but it wasn't a pursuer. It was a man, tall, dark-coated, his hands empty. "Welcome," he said softly. "You made it." Tears filled her eyes. "This is the north?" He nodded. "You're safe now." She sank into the grass, holding her child close, her body trembling from exhaustion and release. For the first time in her life, no one owned her breath. She thought of Samuel, of the way he'd looked at her that last morning, the promise in his eyes. She didn't know if he'd lived or fallen, but she felt him there, somewhere beyond the wind, proud and still watching. She whispered to the air, "You kept your word." The man helped her stand. "What name shall I give them?" he asked gently. Clara looked down at her son. The moonlight touched his face. "Hope Whitmore," she said. Then after a pause, "And I'll be Clara Whitmore." The man smiled faintly. "It suits you." She looked toward the stars, countless, endless. "He bought me for 10 cents, she said softly, "but he gave me the world." The wind carried her words across the river, where dawn was beginning to rise again, soft gold, gentle and free. The year was 1872. The war had ended, and with it, the world that once called itself master and slave. The fields that had been soaked in sorrow were now wild with weeds and flowers. The land still whispered its memories, but the cries had quieted. On the edge of a quiet town in Pennsylvania, a woman stood by a wooden fence, watching her son work the soil. He was tall now, shoulders broad, eyes clear and kind, his skin kissed by the sun. Every movement he made carried strength, but also gentleness, the kind that only grows from knowing both pain and peace. Clara smiled faintly as she watched him. Hope Whitmore, 20 years old, freeborn by the grace of courage and the mercy of faith. She still remembered the night she named him, the moment her lips formed those words beside the river, trembling with exhaustion and gratitude. She'd said it in honor of the man who had once held the power to destroy her but chose instead to free her soul, Samuel Whitmore. His name still lingered like a prayer in her heart. She turned from the fence and walked toward the small cottage behind her. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth, and the table was set with 2 simple plates. Life was quiet now, modest but full. She taught children from the nearby farms to read and write. It was the one gift she could pass on, the same gift Samuel had given her. Letter by letter, night by night, against all laws and reason. Sometimes, When she taught a child to write their name, she'd feel the same wonder she once felt tracing her first letter in the dust. Freedom, she had learned, begins with the power to name yourself. That evening after supper, Clara sat by the window with a small candle flickering beside her. Hope was outside chopping wood, his laughter drifting faintly through the open door as he joked with the neighbor boys. She reached into the drawer of her desk and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, yellowed now, edges worn thin. It was the same piece of paper Samuel had once left on her doorstep, with her name written in her own hand. "You are free to dream." She traced the letters with her fingertip. Her handwriting had been clumsy then, shaky, unsure. Now it was strong, graceful, alive. Outside, the sky turned the color of amber as the sun dipped below the trees. She watched it fade and felt a pull in her chest, a quiet knowing. It had been years since she'd thought about returning south. For a long time, she'd told herself there was nothing left to go back to, no reason, no peace to find. But now, in her twilight years, she felt the weight of one last promise, calling her home. The next morning, she packed a small satchel, some bread, water, a shawl, and the parchment. Hope protested, of course. "Ma, it's too far," he said. "You don't need to go alone." Clara smiled, her eyes soft but steady. "There are things a woman must do with her own 2 feet, son. This is one of them." Hope hesitated, then nodded. He pressed a small wooden cross into her palm. "Take this, then, so I'll be with you, wherever you go." She kissed his forehead. "You already are." 2 days later, Clara arrived back in Georgia. The road that once carried her away now led her back. Quiet, overgrown, heavy with memories. The Whitmore plantation no longer stood in grandeur. Time had stripped it bare. The house was a skeleton of wood and ivy, its windows broken, its fields untended. The fences had fallen, and where cotton once grew, wildflowers now swayed in the breeze. Clara walked slowly through the ruins, her heart caught between sorrow and peace. The air still smelled faintly of magnolia and ash. She reached the old oak, the one where Samuel had once sat, speaking softly to the horizon. Beneath its shade lay a small grave, its headstone simple but clean. The engraving was worn, the letters faint, but still legible. Samuel Whitmore, 1809, 1865. He saw the wrong and chose the right. Clara knelt beside the grave, her fingers brushing the cold stone. Tears came quietly without warning. "I thought I'd never come back," she whispered. "But I couldn't let you lie here forgotten." She opened her satchel and pulled out the parchment. Carefully she unfolded it and placed it on the grave. The wind caught at its corners, but it stayed held by her hand. "You gave me this," she said softly. "You taught me to read it, and to live it." She reached into her pocket and took out a single white flower, one she'd picked from the wild field that now covered the land. She laid it gently atop the parchment. "You bought me for 10 cents, she said, her voice trembling. "But you gave me something no price could measure, the right to call myself human." The wind rose, carrying her words through the trees. For a moment, the leaves above her seemed to whisper back, a sound like peace, like farewell. Clara stayed there until the sun began to fade, painting the sky in gold and rose. Then she rose slowly, her knees stiff, her spirit calm. As she walked away, she looked back one last time at the grave beneath the oak. The flower gleamed white in the twilight, a small, pure light against the fading earth. Her steps were slow but certain as she followed the path back toward the road. The fields glowed beneath the dying sun, the air soft with the hum of crickets and the murmur of life continuing. When she reached the fence at the edge of the property, she paused and turned her face to the horizon. A faint smile touched her lips. Freedom had not erased her past. It had redeemed it. And love, however brief and burdened, had given her the strength to endure it. She whispered to the wind, "Rest easy, Samuel. We made it." Then she turned, walking toward the setting sun, the light wrapping her in gold, her shadow long and steady behind her.